Thank you. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah? Okay, great. So I am Athreya. I work at the Indian Institute of Science in the Department Center for Ecological Sciences. And so we are a group of ecologists and evolutionary biologists. Just to get a feel for how many of you have done either workshops or a course or some exposure to ecology? Anybody? And just to know how much, explaining I should do of concepts. Okay, great. Yeah, concepts that we'll that I want to convey to you. And evolution, evolution by natural selection. Have you been exposed to those ideas? Yeah, great. Okay. So what I thought I would do today is tell you about how, give you an exposure to how one might study animal behavior. You might already have heard a little bit about it, say, from Rohini Balakrishnan. She must have talked to you about animal behavior already, communicating crickets and so on. What I'd like to do today is tell you about some of the excitement and challenges of studying animal behavior in wild populations. What are the constraints, but also what are the excitements, and also how we study them in a changing world. Because we know now that more than ever, landscapes are human dominated, so animals, have had a long evolutionary history that's shaped their behavior, but now the changes that are human-led are also impacting their behavior. So how do we study them in such an environment? So what I have done is try to choose 3 kinds of research stories to convey some of this excitement to you. So, oh, sorry. This may be off, is it? Yeah, oh yeah. Oh, there. Thank you so much. So let me start by giving you an introduction to behavioral diversity. So as you know, humans, if you look at these old cave paintings, you'll find that humans have been interested in how animals behave for a long, long time. And it's also been crucial to survival, to find food, to avoid predators, and so on. So some of these old cave paintings are amazing because the way they have captured the kinds of behaviors that animals show is really something to be seen. And just like you see, if you look in the natural world, you'll see an amazing diversity in form. So these are just different shapes and colors in the insect world. But just like morphological diversity, you also see a marvelous diversity in behavior. So common problems like what to eat, whom to mate with, how to escape from predators have a diversity of solutions. So for example, I've just tried to show you some examples of how animals try to avoid being eaten by predators, and they've come up with different solutions. One solution is try and avoid being detected in the first place. So if you're not seen, then your chances of being caught and eaten are smaller. Another way out is to either incorporate poisons into your tissues so that predators learn that eating you is nasty, you're unpalatable. Or what you can do is, instead of you yourself incorporating those poisons into your tissue, you mimic somebody else. You mimic another species that is poisonous. 2 other solutions of avoiding being eaten. Some other species, again, might rely on very quiet behavior. So these are 2, this is an antelope, an African antelope, and these are deer that you might see in dry deciduous forests in India. And the way they try to avoid being eaten is, first of all, not to be detected, and if they sense a predator, they freeze. Again, trying to avoid being detected. Other animals don't rely on that, instead on camouflage. Instead, what they rely on is spotting a predator early and then fleeing from it as fast as possible. and some of our fastest mammals are, species like antelope that basically have evolved to detect and flee very fast from predators. So one of the things that we do, my students and I do, is try to understand what is the ecological context on which such behaviors are played out, and can we then use that to understand how behaviors have evolved, why you see one particular form in one setting and another particular form in another setting. So the broad framework for understanding this diversity is basically an evolutionary framework. And as you may know, a lot of evolutionary thinking, evolution by natural selection, was spurred by the work of Charles Darwin, and he basically laid out in a lot of detail the theory of evolution by natural selection. Idea is very simple. If you have diversity in a trait and some of that variation in the trait is heritable, and some forms of the trait provide greater advantages either for survival or to obtain mates or to reproduce, to get resources for breeding. If they give you a competitive advantage over other individuals of your own, of the same population, such traits can spread in the population. So we use that framework, and as Darwin realized, that can result in an amazing diversity in traits. So we use that framework. The idea is, say, take a simple problem like forming groups. So there are some species that are solitary, there are others where you find small groups, and there are yet others like the blackbuck antelope in India can form groups of 500, 700, sometimes 1,000. And so you might ask, why? Why do you see 1,000 animals in one place and 2 animals in another place forming a group? So if you have variation in behavior, these different variants give you different benefits. These different variants also carry costs. So if you think of something like grouping, the benefit of grouping is more eyes detect a predator sooner. But a cost, more individuals around you, more competition for the food in the area. So how these benefits and costs trade off will tell us what the behavior that is optimal is. That is the behavior that gives you maximum benefits accounting for cost. So maximum net benefits. This is the framework we try to use to understand diversity. And the important thing here is that these benefits and costs, these trade-offs are not static. They depend on that ecological stage. So if you're in a big grassland with lot of food that can support a lot of individuals, blackbuck antelope can actually form large groups. In a grassland with very sparse food, the cost of competing for food might be greater than the benefit of detecting a predator faster. And that would predict smaller group sizes. So ecological conditions change the shapes of these benefits and costs, and thereby the behavior that is favored in the environment. So that's the idea. It doesn't have to be only ecological, it can be demographic conditions. What you should do under high population density might be very different from what you should do under low population density. Or social conditions. So what you should do when there are a lot of, say, males competing for females might be very different from what you should do when there are relatively few males competing for females. So all these different aspects of the environment can affect these trade-offs and thereby the optimal behavior. So understanding these trade-offs and how environmental conditions affect these trade-offs help us understand behavioral diversity. So this is the broad kind of framework that we use to study the functional, the adaptiveness of behavior and why different forms have evolved in different places. Is this broad framework, is that fairly clear? Okay. So what I'd like to do now is to start off with an example of an example of one of the kind of spectacular forms of behavior that we've been studying. And this is from the blackbuck antelope. How many of you have seen blackbuck? Not too many of you. Well, so the blackbuck previously, say 150 years ago, was one of the most abundant antelope in the Indian plains. So we have all these accounts from old Britishers talking about, herds from horizon to horizon and so on. Now we are very lucky if we see 15, 20 of them in a group. It's an antelope that's endemic to the Indian subcontinent. Males are much larger than females. They have horns. Females don't have horns. Males also have this bright kind of black and white coat color pattern. Females are a duller brown and white. They are largely grazers, meaning their main food is grass. And one of the reasons they make a very nice model system to study in the wild is if you're interested in how ecological conditions affect behavior, it's nice to have a species that actually is found in a range of ecological conditions. So the blackbuck is found in a wide range of habitats. From these kind of, the main habitat are these, grasslands, open grasslands, but you also find them in lightly wooded forest, in scrubland, in thorny shrublands and so on. So because you find them in a range of habitat conditions, you can actually look at how their behavior varies across these ecological contexts. So the story I want to tell you now is about blackbuck in a particular set of conditions. So what you're seeing here is a blackbuck lek, which is a form of mating system that's actually very rare in nature. So fewer than 2% of birds, fewer than 1% of mammals show this mating system. The most common mating system in mammals, for example, are where males either, so typically, females are foraging for food and they're either moving alone or in groups. And typically, males invest more in mate searching and in the process by which mates encounter each other. So the most common systems in mammals are where females are moving in a group. Males then attempt to find groups of females and then try and defend them from other males. So if you see bonnet macaques on, either say our IISc campus or the GKVK University of Agricultural Sciences campus or many other campuses in cities, because these macaques can often be found in an urban setting. There what males are trying to do is basically one or more males try to defend a group of females from other males, and then they attempt to mate with females who are receptive, who are in estrus. So that's a female following kind of mating system, very, very common in mammals. Another very common mating system is where males don't defend females. Instead, what they do is defend a patch of area that has a very good chance of being visited by females. So say in blackbuck, in most populations, what happens is females have a daily circuit. So they go in a group on a grazing circuit. Say they feed, rest, feed, rest. They have these feed and rest kind of patterns. And then in the evening, they are roughly back in the same area, and this keeps shifting across the months. So what males do during the breeding season is basically they defend territories in areas where there is a high density of females moving through. And then as females move through a male's territory, a patch of area that he's defending along this circuit that females are following, females who are in estrus, who are receptive, are then courted by the male who attempts to mate with them. Females can leave at any time. There's a lot of opportunity for females to choose mates. So this kind of a strategy is called a resource defense. So it's not a female defense, it's a resource defense strategy. So these two are probably some of the most common mating strategies in mammals. The lek mating system is completely different. Males don't defend females, males don't defend resources. All the males do, each male here is defending a territory which is a tiny area. maybe sometimes, as small as 10-15 meters across, so 10-15 meters in diameter. This tiny area, which is basically a spot for them to display from. There are no resources. So often these areas, because the males are using them so much, are bare. So there's no food, there's no water, there's no particular reason for females to visit the male except to find a mate. And typically males cluster together. And the whole cluster of territories is called a lek. So this kind of a system has been attracting a lot of attention for two main reasons. First of all, when females come to this aggregation, move among males, choose a mate with the male and leave, because there are no resources attached, one can try to ask, what are females looking for? What information might they be using? What kinds of male phenotype might they be attracted by, and so on. The second reason people have been so interested in this mating system is because males engage in a lot of competition. There is a lot of displaying going on. There are these intense fights where they push each other, horns can gore each other if they're unlucky, and so on. And the question is, why cluster together and experience all this aggression when you can just disperse out into these resource territories that are much more common? So why would a form like this evolve? So anyway, that's not what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to talk to you about one kind of spectacular trait that you see only on these leks. You don't find them anywhere else in any other blackbuck population. So all blackbuck populations don't lek. We only know of two populations in India where you see this mating system. Everywhere else you see resource defense, which I described to you before. Two populations are in Gujarat. There's a population at Velavadar National Park and another one in Rajasthan. So the trait I want to focus on is these things that look like shadows that you see here are these huge scent marks, basically created by males by repeatedly urinating and defecating on the same side. So males have this very stereotypical urination display. So when they either urinate or defecate off their territories, like when they are feeding outside, they don't adopt. They don't show that same behavioral posture. Similarly, for defecation also, they adopt a very visual, very stereotypic posture. And by repeatedly urinating and defecating, they can form these huge, what we call dung piles, basically scent marks. These are like, if you look at Velavadar or Talchapar, the two lekking populations, if you look at it, you can actually see, remotely sensed images, you can actually see these scent marks. They are that visible. So the question is why? They don't do these anywhere else. They look really prominent, and it's quite difficult to maintain because males have to, there's no food there. To keep maintaining these scent marks, they have to leave, feed, and come back. When they leave to feed, other males come and try to take over the territory. So there seems to be something going on. So what we wanted to do was to figure out what are these scent marks all about. And surprisingly, even though scent is so important in mammals, we have very few studies from wild populations because it can be often very difficult to study. Most mammals are actually, except for a few primates and antelope, are actually very difficult to study because you find them in forests, you can't see them easily, you can't follow them easily. Blackbuck and some primates are some of the few exceptions where you can actually study behavior. They make it easier for you to study behavior. So we said, okay, let's first get some basic natural history. We can't make up hypotheses for why these scent marks are there, what their function might be, unless we know a little bit about how are they formed, how do they grow, and so on. And one really nice thing here is that every monsoon, so blackbuck are found in these grassland ecosystems, which are largely kind of, the monsoon is a big feature there. So in the monsoon in June, July, August, the whole grassland gets swept clean of all the dung. So the leks get swept clean of dung. So you kind of have, at least visually, nothing there. And then males start establishing territory. So you can actually kind of track the life of a dung pile. Where do they start? How do they grow? And so on. So that's what we did. So After a monsoon, we went and sampled all dung piles. Not only on the lake, but the convenient thing is in the same population, you have individuals adopting those other strategies, the resource defense. So we went to all territories, whether lake territories or resource territories, started following dung piles and measured them every 2 weeks. And I just want to show you a quick summary of some of the data. So just to show you, this is I think I hadn't shown you what the female blackbuck looks like. This is what a female looks like. These are two males who are just about to start fighting. Here is one male on the boundary of his territory, and this female is visiting this other male. This picture is also here to remind me to tell you that a lot of the activity on a lake territory takes place on this dung pile. So a lot of the displaying, female visits, females seem to smell the dung pile and so on. The dung pile seems to be a very important part of the territory. So what you find is that if you follow the life of the dung pile from September all the way through to the next year, what I have done is shown you the size at two important times. So blackbuck have two mating seasons. A smaller mating season, which is September, October, and the main mating season, which is the March-April peak. So the interesting thing is that the lake territories, so till the October peak, dung piles are growing in a similar way on all resource territories, meaning males are scent marking at roughly similar rates in all these territories. But then during this March-April peak, the dung piles on the lake are much larger than the dung piles on the resource territories. So there's something to do with this basically gave us a clue that there's something to do with what's happening on the lake that might help us pose hypotheses for why we see what the function of these dung piles are. So what happens on the lake that's not so prominent on these resource territories? Two things happen. First of all, fights are much more intense on lake territories. Resource territories also, male defend them from other males who are trying to come and take over these territories. But this is particularly intense on lake territories. The second thing that happens is visits by females are much more common. So females, we've already shown that females show a strong preference to come and mate with lekking males rather than the males on these resource territories. So this made us think that, okay, there could be three kind of contexts in which dung piles play a role. First of all, the most common hypothesis in the literature is, mammalian scent marking by males. It largely acts as a scent fence. So this hypothesis has been given for, marking by wolves, marking by mice, marking by, different rodents, marking by, lagomorphs, so those are hares and so on, marking by ungulates. The idea is that by regularly marking an area, you're basically saying there is a resident here, there is a resident here. It acts as a fence to keep away intruders. So that's a broad hypothesis. We thought, okay, it could act as a fence, but it seems to be more than that, because if it was just acting as a fence, you should see similar scent marking rates both on these resource territories and on lake territories. So we thought it could maybe also act as a signal in male-male competition in these fights, because fights are very expensive. So in many systems, you find signals, a series of signals and escalation in behavior before outright aggression, because if you can avoid the costs of fighting, it pays off to do that. So we thought, okay, maybe scent marks could provide information to males in the context of fights. Then our third hypothesis was that maybe, it's possible, these are not mutually exclusive. They could play a role both in male-male competition, but the other context could be in female choice. So maybe females who are visiting the lakes are getting information from these scent marks. Thereby scent marks evolve. So that's the function of scent marks. So the next step what we did was to look at territories that varied in fights and territories that varied in female popularity, in female visits, and then see where do you find the highest scent marking rates. So what we found there was that this is where you find the most females visiting, and here both on the leg. So these are territories on the leg but not in the center. So basically what's happening is, I should have shown you a map of the leg, but when you go on to a leg, females prefer to visit and mate on central territories than on the periphery of the leg. So scent marking rates are also highest on the central territories and much lower outside, and in fact scent marking rates of either these non-central territories on the leg or these resource territories are largely similar. So we got a clue that maybe these scent marks are involved in this mate choice. So this led us to our next experiment, where set of observations where we said, okay, here is a dung pile. What is the information that females could be getting from these dung piles? There's a variety of information. One thing that struck us is that in these systems, a female setting out to mate is actually taking up a very risky activity. These are group living animals, usually found in these large social herds. Females have to leave them, move on their own, find a mate when they're receptive, and come back. And their main predators in this population are wolves, and they face other risks also from feral dogs, from humans, and so on. So a female, it's important for a female to find a mate of high quality. She can't come and hang out at the lek, observe different males, and try to, assess different aspects of their phenotype. That's what we were thinking. So we were thinking, what would be a good, what would be good indirect bits of information she could use to find high quality males. So one thing that's already been described in the literature and which we have also found is that females seem to go to the center as a rule of thumb. And that can work because if females go to the center, central territories have high mating benefits. Males should fight for these central territories. So you'd get the males of highest competitive ability in the central territories mating with females. And if high competitive ability does provide a benefit to females from choosing mates, then you could see the centrality working out really well. So we thought similarly, maybe the dung piles could provide similar information. Because think about a dung pile. What a dung pile is a male repeatedly urinating and defecating. When his territory is taken over by another male doesn't make a new dung pile. He continues to urinate and defecate on this same territory. So what you have is a kind of history of male residence. That's in the longer term. Even in the shorter term, when a male, he has to leave the leg to feed, some males get a lot of challenges when they are away. You have other males coming in, either neighboring males or new males trying to get a territory. They come and what they do is they start marking on these dung piles. Other males, for whatever reason, don't get as many challenges. And similarly, some males leave the leg a lot to feed. Other males somehow manage to just stay without feeding on the leg. So we thought the other thing that dung piles could do is provide information on which males have been successful at consistently keeping out intruders. Because their dung piles will have fewer of strange male marks than the dung piles of males, who are not good at keeping out intruders. So again, a female doesn't now have to stay at a leg for a long time to see these dynamics. They can basically use the dung pile to figure out who's been there for how long and so on. So to test this idea, what we did is we carried out a small experiment where we had a set of experimental territories where we added a small quantity of stranger dung, fresh stranger dung, and it's the equivalent of a strange male spending about half an hour there. Just a very small quantity. So you saw that huge dung pile, right? So on that huge dung pile, a small quantity of strange dung to simulate intrusion. And then the problem is we are walking there, tramping about, there's our scent also, right? So to control for that, on a set of control territories, we went there and just replaced the own male's dung in a similar way. So that allows for them, getting the same exposure to our movement, our scent, and so on. And then what we did is we had already watched these territories before we went out and did this. So we had female visits to these territories, before our treatment and after. And what we want to see is how much of a change is there in female visits to these territories. So what we found is that there is, so even on the control territories, there are fewer females visiting after than before, but that decrease is much higher. So females, the number of females visiting territories where we've simulated this intrusion is basically much lower than on control territories. So it seems like we inferred that females prefer territories without recent scent marks from intruders. So then the other thing we did was we quickly wanted to check whether, if it's really important for females, males should also be paying attention to information in the dung pile. Because males should, if they are receiving intruders, males should then maybe increase their boundary patrolling, basically try and keep away intruders because it can affect their mating success. It can affect how many females visit them. So we had to do the same. We did a similar experiment, but we had to do it at the time of a day when females are not there. Because when females are there, males don't pay much attention to the dung pile. They are constantly courting females and so on. So we carried out a similar experiment where we said, okay, do owners of popular territories. Remember I told you that the central territories are where females visit very often, not on peripheral territories. So we asked, do owners of popular territories, are they much more likely to respond to a simulated intrusion than owners of territories where females are not turning up anyway? And the reason we wanted to ask this is because responding is costly. A male who's choosing to display is basically allocating more time to display, less time from feeding, less time from being vigilant to predators and so on. So any kind of response is expensive. If it wasn't, they should be responding very similarly, but because it's expensive, we thought that males might be strategically choosing to respond depending on how important it is for them to respond, meaning how large the benefits are that they stand to lose out on if they experience an intrusion. So we did a very similar experiment, and what we found is that males on these popular territories, they basically respond much more than do males on these less popular territories. And we followed that up with a series of experiments and found that, males, it's actually quite amazing how much attention males seem to pay to scent marks. So we did a series of experiments where we wanted to ask, again, because responding, like I told you, is very costly, males should be strategic. So then we asked, okay, what about neighbor scent versus stranger scent? Males are interacting a lot with neighbors, they've assessed them, so they don't need to continue assessing them as much as they would do if there's a stranger intrusion. So we did some neighbor-stranger experiments and found that basically if you give stranger, their response to a stranger is much higher than their response to a neighbor, and in many different ways. They are more alert, they spend more time in this border patrols, they spend more time scent marking if you simulate a stranger intrusion compared to a neighbor intrusion. And then we also asked, but why? Why neighbors might also be a threat. What is it about strangers? Why do they respond more to strangers? And by looking at who takes over a resident male's territory, we found that strangers are much more likely to take over a resident male's territory than a neighbor. So that might explain why males are paying so much more attention towards simulated intrusions of strangers than of neighbors. So what I wanted to basically convey to you from this piece of work is that, you know, we went out there, saw this large, strange scent mark, and kind of following that through a series of questions, it was really very interesting, very fascinating to see how that scent mark seems to play a very important role both in how females might choose mates and apparently also in how males assess intruder threat and how they choose to engage in these costly displays and scent marking behavior and so on. So just to wrap this up, the indications are these scent marks seem to play an important role in mate choice and territorial behavior. Information seems to be used both by females visiting the leks and by these territorial males interacting. I may not go into this in great detail, but you know, all of you have heard of elaborate peacock trains, right? You know, female choice, sexual selection. Sexual selection is basically competition between individuals, specifically for mates or fertilizations, and any trait that gives you an advantage in that competition is said to evolve through sexual selection. So typically we think of visual traits like you know, long tail feathers, weapons like the blackbuck horns and so on, or we think of kind of acoustic traits, elaborate bird song. But now there's a lot of interest in seeing whether you can get similar exaggerated scent ornaments, and maybe we've not studied them so much so far because to us we may not, it's easier for us to see and get intrigued by a long peacock's tail than smells or something else. It's just much more difficult for us to detect. So the second part of what I wanted to talk to you about is to do with animal behavior in a changing world. And how we got interested in that was because this trait that I've been talking to you about, these large scent marks, these kind of spectacular traits, are actually extremely rare. They were not so rare more than 100 years ago, but today, if you just take the example of blackbuck, elaborate scent marks, this lek mating system, which I told you is a very rare mating system, large social groups, so I told you blackbuck can form 500, 800 you know, individuals joining together and forming a group, are now restricted to just two populations. It's so you know, you have blackbuck actually even on the outskirts of Bangalore. You have blackbuck all over Karnataka, I mean the drier areas of Karnataka, Maharashtra, parts of Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, parts of Tamil Nadu, parts of Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh and so on, but nowhere will you see these behaviors now. So part of the extinction, so we don't have the extinction of a species here, but do have behaviors going extinct, and one of the reasons appears to be density. So these behaviors are typically seen when you see high population densities, and a lower population densities you don't see that. So we were intrigued about why behavior changes when densities drop, and that got us studying this low density population in Maharashtra. It's a very lovely landscape there too. But one difference, so the place I've been telling you till now talking to you about is this population in Gujarat. This is what the landscape there looks like. Large open grasslands, largely blackbuck. It's very different out here. Again, beautiful grasslands, but a big difference is that you have livestock, there are agricultural fields, there are plantations, all interspersed with these small grassland patches. So it's this very interesting matrix of different land use types, from protected grasslands, forest plantations, grazing lands for livestock, and these agricultural fields. So what we wanted to ask here is, okay, you have a healthy population, and then you have, series of human activities like, say, grazing or, agricultural activity. How does a species like blackbuck, because it's a kind of a largish animal. Something smaller you might expect, to be less visible, perhaps less affected by human activities. But we wanted to know how might blackbuck respond to something like this. So, of course, either the population can go extinct or it can persist together with the different activities in that area. So, to address this question, we looked at this population in southern Maharashtra, and this is a very interesting area because there are many endemic and threatened species in this very human-dominated landscape. This is the great Indian bustard. I think there's something like fewer than 200-300 individuals in the wild. This is the Indian wolf, blackbuck, of course. This is the lesser florican, all found in these grasslands. So we looked at two kinds. So animals could respond to these, these changing conditions due to human activities in two. We thought, okay, in two possible ways that we wanted to study. One is through deciding where to use, which habitat areas to use. So these are habitat use decisions. And also through their behavior. Even in an area, after choosing to be in that area, they can also respond through different social traits. I should quickly mention here that, when behavioral ecologists like me use words like choose and decision and so on, we don't mean animals consciously looking around and, cognitively making these decisions of I'll do this now, I'll do this then. It's kind of shorthand to basically say, here are evolved traits. Certain animals, certain individuals in the past who happened to show a particular behavioral response, if they left more offspring and that trait was heritable, you would expect that trait to spread through the population. So when I say choose, select, and decision, what I mean are actually evolved responses, not current assessment or, higher cognitive tasks like that. Okay, so how might human activity influence blackbuck? Take something like one of the main activities in that area is grazing by livestock. What this can do is it can change the abundance and quality of resources because livestock feed on grass, blackbuck also feed on grass. It can also increase risk because there are dogs that accompany these herds. Sometimes there's hunting by humans and so on. So what we did was in this area, we studied habitat patches all across this landscape. We measured different risk factors. We measured food and so on. And then we looked at which of these ecological factors and anthropogenic factors best predicts, which of these can help us understand how animals use habitats in these landscapes. So just to tell you that if you look at how ecological conditions are distributed, I mean like factors important for blackbuck are distributed across this landscape, there are three broad habitat types that we looked at. These are these protected grasslands. So in protected grasslands, food is good and livestock, people, dogs are not allowed in. You also have forest plantations, which again, livestock, people, dogs are not allowed in. But blackbuck, remember, are open plains, grassland species. The trees there are, from previous work, we already know blackbuck do not prefer to be in habitats where the habitat is not open, but kind of covered, more closed because of shrubs and trees and so on. And finally, you have unprotected grasslands, which are nice and open. So from the point of view of openness, they are very good. But one thing that is different there is that you have livestock, people, dogs, and so on. So if you look at food in these three habitats, if you look at grass what I'm showing you here is grass height. Blackbuck are basically short grass species because short grasses have the highest nutrition content because of cropping by other herbivores. And they are also because of the height of the animals, previous work has shown that visibility for animals is best from an anti-predation point of view, is best in unprotected grasslands. So if you look at both food and openness, these are the best habitat types, these unprotected grasslands, compared to protected grasslands and plantations. We also measured different aspects of protein content, all these different nutritional levels. Again, nutritional levels are best in these areas, intermediate here and kind of worst in these plantations. But what do you find? So these show you blackbuck numbers over time in these three habitats. Blue are these protected grasslands, black are unprotected grasslands and plantations. And what you find is that blackbuck seem to be affected both by risk and by resources. If you compare the protected and unprotected grasslands, these black ones here, unprotected grasslands, although reward is better here, risk is lower in the protected grasslands. And what blackbuck seem to be doing is they seem to be valuing, safety more than the better nutritional levels in forage. But interestingly, these plantations are also protected. But like I told you, they have tree cover, which these animals don't prefer. So even though they're protected from livestock, people and so on, the natural sources of risk blackbuck seem to be perceiving them as higher than in these unprotected grasslands. So if you look at habitat use responses, animals are using unprotected areas, but they seem to be preferring the protected grasslands, even though they are worse off in terms of food than the unprotected grasslands. What animals can also do is change their social behavior. So what blackbuck appear to be doing is, if you look at how grouping happens, both in plantations and in unprotected grasslands, they group much more than in protected grasslands. So grouping is a way that allows you to respond more quickly to predation risk through different ways. One is a dilution effect. If there are many more of you, then your per capita chance of experiencing a risk goes down. If there are many more of you, you might detect predators faster. There are other effects also, like a confusion effect. If there are many more of you running, it's much more difficult for a predator to target an individual in a group. It's called the confusion effect. So what you find is that apart from deciding where to be, animals might possibly also respond to threats by changing their behavior in the place that they are, and they seem to be doing it in a flexible way. So in protected grasslands where there is both natural sources of threat, so high cover, tree cover is not there, and anthropogenic sources of threat, dogs, etc. are not there. Protected grasslands, they don't cluster, group as much as they do, both in compared to plantations where natural sources of threat are high, and unprotected grasslands where anthropogenic sources of threat are high. The other very interesting thing that we saw was that even in these unprotected grasslands, if you look at the pattern of human activity, people bring in their herds typically around 10 or 11. So early morning, there's hardly any human activity, either dogs, people, cattle, etc. And cattle leave that area very late in the evening. And what we found, and we were very surprised that, animals seem to be able to respond even within like the period of a day. What we found is that if you look at these unprotected grasslands, the clustering in the evening when people are around, people, cattle, etc. are around, is much greater than in the morning when there's much less human activity. And for comparison, what I've done is shown you the protected grassland, and you can see that there is no such time of day effect. They are similarly clustered, whether it's in the morning or it's in the evening. So all this seems to suggest that animals might be able to respond behaviorally through a landscape that's kind of dynamic in risk and rewards in resources. And this might actually help promote the persistence. So this is a near threatened species, threatened antelope. It might help promote the persistence even of, these very relatively large, quite conspicuous animals in a human-dominated landscape. So I think I'll end here. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Ma'am, you said that you observe the dung piles. Like, how is this observation done? Doesn't the human intervention cause some disturbance?
Yeah. So, what we were very lucky that, next to each one of these clusters of territories, there is a watchtower. So we could observe behavior from the watchtower, and very interesting that blackbuck, if you're on ground level with them and make a noise or you're obvious, they do pay attention to you. But if you're above, maybe because they don't have aerial predators, if the same sound or these sounds come from above, they don't pay any attention. They don't show any alert behavior or anything of that sort. We did have to go and measure the dung piles once in 2 weeks. So when we go onto the lek or onto these other territories, the animals do leave, but we measured the time they take to come back, and within 5 to 15 minutes after we left, individuals came back on the territory. So what we used to do is, exactly because of that reason, we timed these measurements to times of the day when there was not much mating activity. So this was usually around 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock in the afternoon hours was when there was very little activity.